And now we are going to stay on the topic of sustainable finance with our next panel on the spectrum of sustainable investment, balancing fiduciary duty with environment and social impacts. This panel will explore the different stakeholders involved with responsible investment, all the way from pension funds to asset managers to grassroots communities, foundation. We will discuss the fiduciary duty as it relates to each stakeholder and the level in the spectrum of how this can be managed with environment and social impacts objectives for sustainable investment.
So now we'd like to welcome our moderator, Majid Mirza, founder and CEO of ESG Tree, our organizing partner and a critical part of having the sustainable finance event at the conference. So Majid is a global expert on impact investing and ESG. Former head of impact investing at various organizations and founding board member of the Canada Forum for Impact Investing and Development. He has led ESG strategy, reporting, and research for over a dozen private equity firms, foundations, and government entities. Majid's doctoral research is on ESG in private capital markets. He regularly lectures at the university level on the topic of social and sustainable finance. Majid will get us started by introducing the panelists.
Thank you so much to both Puchi and Leah. Thank you. This is really exciting because of our panel members, because they're all exciting people. And I'm so blessed to know them both at a professional and personal basis. Could we do a quick feedback from the audience to see who we are there? So how many corporate business and entrepreneurship people are in the audience with a show of hands? Okay, that gives a good, I'd say about 20%. How many students? Great, also about 20%. Academics, researchers? Oh, okay, they went up a bit late, but eventually it went up. So 20% again. And then how about government representatives? It's a very equalized audience, as you can see. And for that reason, in this panel, we're not going to get too much into the technicalities of finance and structures, but more about how to balance this fiduciary duty that investment firms have with the desire to do impact. We know all of us want to create social and environmental impact, but there's this looming responsibility on our heads to also deliver value to shareholders who have provided their hard-earned income to everyone on this panel. And just before we start, I wanted to provide a little more background on the panel. Finance and investment, by some theorists, has been known to be the part of the iceberg that is below the surface. So we look at the economy as being businesses and physical infrastructure that we see, but what's backing all of this infrastructure is the finance and investment that has huge influence on how environmental social factors are carried out. And with that, I'll introduce the panel. To my right is Gerhard Pries, founder and former CEO of Sarona Asset Management. Gerhard stands as a visionary leader in impact investment with over 25 years of experience. His career centers on private equity investing in emerging markets, driven by a dedication to achieving robust financial returns alongside positive social environmental impact. So we can see Gerhard is the perfect person for this panel, according to the introduction. Stéphanie Émond, VP and Chief Impact Officer, FinDev Canada. Stéphanie is a seasoned professional in financial inclusion, sustainable growth, and impact investing. At FinDev Canada, she oversees development impact, environmental and social risk management, and thought leadership initiatives. I must go on to mention, Stéphanie, that just hearing the name FinDev Canada, a lot of people might not know that FinDev Canada is Canada's federal official development finance institution, which is managing the government and the people of Canada's money for development overseas. So it's a newer organization, so I thought I'd provide that extra perspective. Brian Minns is the Senior Managing Director of Responsible Investing at University Pension Plan. Brian is a seasoned professional in responsible investing, leading the integration of responsible investing into UPP's total portfolio approach and corporate practices. And last but not least, Hasan Askari, who's also providing the U.S. perspective, south of the border from us, into his perspective on Canadian investment and Canadian pension funds and his work in the U.S. Hasan is a managing partner at K1 Investment Management and is a graduate of the Marshall School of Business at USC, where he received a BS in Business Administration. He serves on the directors of Uganda Project, a grassroots nonprofit focused on supporting orphans in Uganda, and is a member of Young Presidents Organization. So thank you again, all, for being here. With those introductions, let's get into the discussion. So just to kick it off, I wanted to hear from everyone, maybe 1 to 2 minute introductions about your perspective of what your work is involved with, and how do you integrate environmental, social, and governance, or ESG, or sustainability integrations in the work that you've been doing or are doing right now. Gerhard, can we start with you?
Let me start. Perfect, thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and it's hard to follow a guy like J.P. Gladu. What a passionate voice, and I fully agree with him that there is a path to reconciliation in Canada that is instructive, potentially instructive to the rest of the world. My work has been in emerging markets my whole career, and I don't think there's a country in the world that has as much potential for cultural reconciliation or cultural harmony than Canada. And so for us to blow this one would not be good. I think we can do it, and we can be a beacon for other parts of the world. Sorry. Gerhard, Pries, Sarona Asset Management. As mentioned, my career, emerging market, Sarona Asset Management, founder and chair. Our work is private equity and venture capital in emerging markets, so Latin America, Africa, and Asia. We invest directly into companies, but for the last 15 years, it's been primarily supporting local private equity managers, local venture capital managers, investing in their funds and co-investing with them directly into companies, but they always lead the deals. We don't pick off companies and invest directly anymore on our own. To your question, how in integration of impact strategies or impact focus, impact objectives into the investments, it's a challenge. There are there's more than 2 ways of doing it. 2 ways of doing it could be, you invest in what's extent. That is, you want to support climate, so you invest in climate infrastructure, you invest in renewable energy projects, etc. Or you want to support women's empowerment, you invest in women-led businesses. You invest in that which is already extant. Or you can address the rest of the market, invest there, and try to bring about changes to empower women into positions of governance and ownership and directorship, etc. And at Sarona, we've done both of those, but primarily it's more the latter. That is, being the yeast in the dough in the capital markets and seeking to invest with companies that are ready to embrace impact strategies and then helping them get there. So gap analyses, strategies for improvement, etc. Moving companies and leaders, business leaders, from mediocre scores on, that sounds compliance-driven. It's not compliance-driven, but it's from mediocre to leading in the business community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's great, Gerhard. So 2 strategies: either invest in the thematic area where you want to impact, or invest in general and then try to impact that area within the business.
Try to change the world.
Yep. Amazing. Good summary. Stephanie?
Yes, well, it's really a pleasure and an honor to be here and to be part of this great team. And, Gerhard has been a pioneer in the development finance space. So maybe I'll start by, you gave a good overview of FinDev Canada, but we were established 6 years ago in 2018 as Canada's development finance institution to complement the tools that Canada has to support international development. So we don't manage all of Canada's official development assistance. We really focus on working through the private sector to enable them to contribute to inclusive and sustainable economic growth in emerging and developing economies only. And so the tools that we have is investment capital. So we finance or invest in companies, private companies, financial institutions, private equity funds, or projects across Latin America, the Caribbean, Sub-Saharan Africa, and just recently the Indo-Pacific region as well. And so, and we do this, of course, to drive positive impacts. So we've chosen 3 priority impact objectives: climate and nature action, gender equality, and market development. And our role, we don't have that impact directly. Our role is to enable our clients, our investees, to advance these objectives. So for us, being this DFI, we really have this dual mandate to advance positive impact, while at the same time delivering financial returns. And that's really important. The topic here is balancing. And for us, it's not an either or. We do have to drive that positive impact while also managing the potential negative impacts of our investments, while also delivering financial returns. In terms of, Gerhard, you talking about those 2 strategies, I think it's similar for us as well, because when we look at an investment opportunity, well, we can see companies that are really high performers already, and we want them to scale. So, we want to reward those high performers and providing them the capital they need to scale and grow. But we also want to, nudge or work with companies that could really transform to, have more positive impacts. So, enable them to better manage environmental and social and governance risks and start delivering positive impacts in terms of, quality job creations, improved business practices that can promote more inclusive workplaces, for example, or better use of natural resources, for example. So all that is really integrated into the way that we invest.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Stéphanie. Brian, your perspectives on what you do at UPP and how you integrate sustainability and ESG?
Sure. So first of all, who is UPP? So University Pension Plan Ontario. We're relatively new, so we're going to celebrate our 3rd birthday on July 1st. Pension plan for Ontario's university sector. So we're jointly sponsored, so both employees and employers sit at the top governance table. It's defined benefit, so there's a new plan for the universities that join, but we're also taking over all pre-existing accumulated assets and liabilities. And it's for Ontario's university sector. So we just had a few new groups, one from the University of Ottawa, another one from Toronto. So variety of different university-related people associated. So whether it's academic staff or staff within a university that are being associated with. We now have 40,000 members of the plan. And now from an impact perspective, really the only thing we need to do is make sure that we can pay the pensions that have been promised to our members. So everyone is contributing, so both employees and the employers are contributing. The money's going into the plan to fund people's retirement. And so everything we do from an investment perspective is to try to meet those pension obligations. We don't want to have to increase the cost of the pension plan, and we don't want to decrease benefits. And to do that, we need to maintain adequate investment returns over the very long term. So from an impact perspective, the way that we think about it is not so much around trying to achieve a specific impact with our investments, but we think about the systems in which we operate and how those systems enable the investment returns that we need over the very long term. So the easiest example is the climate. The research is showing us it's going to be a lot easier for us to achieve long-term investment returns the more stable the climate is. And therefore, we have a big focus on activity around climate change, not just in terms of changing what's in our investment portfolio, but trying to find opportunities to insert ourselves in and amplify our message around trying to push towards stabilization of the climate. It could be real economy matters with companies that are in high-emitting sectors. It could be the consumers of those products and so on. So basically, we're trying to change the systems when and where it makes sense because it will have a big impact on our ability to achieve investment returns for our members. And I'll just say two things about that. So one is around investment. That's more on the stewardship side. So that'll be around that public policy advocacy, but we also do work with publicly traded companies in our portfolio, meet with them directly, and advocate for better practices around environmental and social issues. And then we also took on proxy voting recently for a number of our portfolios, so directly voting on what's happening at these publicly traded companies. And the other leg is on investment decisions. So we sit with the investment team and help them incorporate environmental and social and governance factors into their investment decisions and help them monitor investments over time as well. So two main pieces there.
Wonderful, Brian. Thank you so much. Hasan, your perspectives at what's happening at K1 and ESG integration, and maybe we can blend over so you can continue, Hasan, with providing some examples of what those programs actually look like. Maybe a lot of the audience members are saying, okay, this is great sort of frameworks. What do those programs look like?
Sure. So we are a private equity firm based in Los Angeles. All we do is invest in B2B enterprise software companies, which by definition, will say, obviously, when you think about the environment, carbon footprint is fairly muted compared to more traditional businesses. Whenever we tell our story, we always kind of started with people like me are very good at telling other people how to do things, but aren't very good at doing them themselves. So a kind of key way in which we run our business is we never ask anybody else to improve their business or have more meetings or hire differently unless we're doing it ourselves. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of, we are hired by our investors essentially to build sustainable market-leading businesses, which generally speaking, from a financial-oriented individual or organization, that means you're going to have a really good return because market-leading businesses. But you need them to last over a long period of time because that's what drives value. So when we think about the initiatives that we have inside of our companies, it is very much built around some of the things that were already said is how do you kind of build something that is sustainable, whether it's, hey, we think the climate is going in a certain direction and we think that's the right thing to do, or whether it's hiring certain types of diverse talent, we think that's better performance. So at K1, we built a building that's kind of gold LEED certified. Most of our power is solar generated. We pay our employees to drive electric vehicles. Socially, for us, again, the private equity industry, honestly, people went to the same school, they worked at the same firms, and they all looked the same. So for us, a key measure of success is how many of our employees were the first in their family to go to college, which in the US is a big problem, right? So that is, we are finance people and numbers people, so we like to track everything. So, over about 25% of our employees, first in the family to ever go to college, which then in of itself drives the level of diversity that we want. So we're almost half women, almost half of our employees are from minority groups. I'm an immigrant myself into the US, moved to the US at a time that people like me weren't very welcome. So I think that's something that we try and drive into the organization. And then when we push it to portfolio companies, we, again, track everything through systems and data, as you're very familiar with. But then also want to make sure that, I think 75% of our businesses have a sustainability champion identified in the business that can own the outcome. To your question about how some of these programs work, we spend a lot of time, because we are hiring people straight out of college. To my point earlier, we don't hire from the traditional backgrounds. So that requires a tremendous amount of investment into training and development, right, if you want to get to the outcome that you want. So we've got multiple levels of training programs, whether that's inside of K1 or in the portfolio companies. A good example of this is, inside of K1, we've got a program that's specifically oriented around developing women leaders. And even at the portfolio level, our two largest portfolio companies are run by women, one of whom is an African-American woman. And our belief is, in our business, 80 to 85% of the value that you bring is around talent and people, and then that drives the rest of the organization. So if you look at what happened to those two businesses as an example, when we made the CEO a woman, it just naturally drove more diversity into the organization as well. So now when we hire into that company, it actually is an intentional, because you have to be intentional about these things. It's an intentional thing that we want the workforce to be more diverse. So our job as the owner of these businesses is to enable the management teams to drive change in an industry that I would argue is typically doesn't historically care. So giving them that level of support to drive that. So I'll pause there because I could talk about this quite a bit, but I think it's our job as people in finance, the folks that in many ways can control the money, that gives you a lot of power in terms of how it is spent and the way it is used. So we always try our best to make sure that we're enabling things to go in a different direction than the way that it's gone historically.
Those are great examples, Hasan. And we heard private equity quite a lot. Even UPP, even though you mentioned the public markets, Brian, has a private market practice. So Sarona Asset Management, private equity, FinDev Canada is doing private equity transactions, K1 pure private equity, UPP public and private equity. And I don't know how many people, we could do a quick trivia. I have a question here. So the question is, what do dominoes, what does or do? It's a plural, so let's see how it works out with the sentence. What do dominoes? Let's try does and not do, Gerhard. What does Domino's Pizza, Toys R Us, Gibson Guitars, and PetSmart have in common? What do these companies have in common? Anyone want to shout out? They're all owned by private equity firms. And many times we look at a Domino's and the size of that franchise and we'll assume that it's publicly listed, but it's actually owned by private investors. It could be a K1, for example, that does buyout, 100% buyout, that owns a single investor could have the entire environmental and social footprint in their hands for all of Domino's, pretty much globally, if you're setting standards at the corporate level. So with that, I'd love to come to the topic at hand, and thank you so much for those amazing introductions. Fiduciary duty, managing fiduciary duty to shareholders, and at the same time trying to incentivize impact. Seeing that we have such a diverse audience, Gerhard, could I get your help in defining fiduciary duty before we start that discussion?
Well, fiduciary duty is your financial duty to your owner of capital. And the owner of capital, in your case, is the government of Canada. In your case, would be the pension plan or the retirees that are going to live off of it. You and I, it's different investors, institutional and private investors. And we each have a responsibility to the owner of those pools of capital to honor the financial obligations to them.
Perfect, wonderful, Gerhard. That sets the fiduciary duty side. So now, would someone like to jump in and talk about this trade-off? Is there a trade-off between managing fiduciary duty and environmental social impact, or does it not exist and we're talking about it for no reason?
Well, I go first. So for us, we have a duty of loyalty to our plan members, and we have a duty ultimately to act in their best interest through a pension plan, that means we need to pay their pension as expected. They put money in, employer puts money in, they take the money out when they retire. That's what we have to do. So there's a lot of work around structuring the plan in terms of what our investments look like, how we structure them from an asset mix perspective, so the different public equities, private equities, infrastructure, real estate, and so on, giving us the best chance that we think that we have of achieving the required rate of return so that we can pay those pensions out over the long term. So we don't have a mandate to have positive social or environmental impacts. That said, if I tie that back to that systems level view of the world, if some of those systems breaking down will make it harder to achieve those long-term investment returns, then that is what opens the door to doing a bit more. And so that's where the opportunity exists. If there are things that we can do as a pension plan to help protect and enhance those systems that will in turn help us achieve better or make the investment returns that we need for the plan, then we can do those. But if we can't view our actions through that lens of helping achieve our investment returns that are required, then there's a lot that we can't do.
Thanks, Brian. Stephanie, any thoughts?
Well, just so our duty, being a Crown corporation and a development finance institution, so we, as opposed to UPP, we have this dual mandate to, on the one hand, reach financial sustainability and deliver financial returns, while also having intentional, measurable, positive impacts through our financing and investment activities. And so, you know, there's no trade-off at that level. What we do have to balance is that, you know, we are building a portfolio of transactions. And every transaction is different from a risk return and an impact perspective. So we aim through each transaction to optimize this. And, you know, we see risks and opportunities throughout each transaction, and we manage one and try to maximize the other while also, you know, really working within the particular context of our clients and the country that we're operating in. So the balance is about reaching this really high-performing portfolio on the financial and impact perspective that is built, of course, through individual transactions.
Nice. Any other thoughts on that?
You asked the question, is there a conflict between fiduciary duty and social environmental objectives? Can you have your cake and eat it too? And I think in many parts of the economy, the answer is yes, you can. It's a choice in terms of how you run a company. You can run it very progressively with progressive management, a lot of diversity, and you actually get better results. There are, however, places where the risk is too high, the economy is not developed enough, and you need institutions like Stephanie's here, development finance institutions that'll take extra risk, don't demand as high a return in order to develop a certain part of the economy. And some parts of the economy will never deliver the level of financial return that some owners of capital need. And pension funds are particularly ones that a pension fund manager like Brian can't say, I will voluntarily invest for 5%, and that'll put my pensioners at risk. He's not allowed to do that. Whereas family investors can do that. As a family can decide, we have $10 million and we'd like to invest at a higher level of risk or lower return, whatever. But some investors can't choose to do that.
Mm-hmm. So it's important. Stephanie, go ahead.
I wanted just to build on this because so FinDev Canada, so we have this dual mandate. We need to build our portfolio. But really, the point of organizations like us is, you know, to bring in more capital. So, you know, all of the DFI capital is too little. We don't have, the multilateral development banks and DFIs don't have enough capital to meet the investment needs in emerging and developing economies. And in particular, Canada's DFI, you know, we're a drop in that bucket of financing that is needed to achieve our goals, our global goals. And so we need to develop investable opportunities for UPP to find it an interesting investment. And I think that's a key focus area of DFIs and multilateral development banks that we need to start making advancements on.
Mm-hmm. Right?
Can I just make one point on the required rate of return for a pension fund? So we have a discount rate, and we do actuarial assumptions. So we look at all the liabilities, all the 40,000 people, and we think about how long are they going to work, how much money are they going to make, when are they going to retire, how long are they going to be retired for, and we figure out these are the liabilities. We look at our assets. What are all the investments we have today? And then we think, well, how do we have to change our investments to make sure we can pay all those liabilities? So that's our actual target, is the discount rate. It's not maximizing investment returns. We don't have a mandate to maximize investment returns. We have a mandate to hit that number with as little risk as we possibly can. So in some respects, there are opportunities to take not lower returns for risk, but low returns that have low risk. So it's not impossible. It has places in the portfolio. It just tends not to be the focus of pension plans.
Mm-hmm. Really interesting. And it keeps tying back to this thing about the different types of investors and investment organizations and the asset classes. You have impact investors that are impact first. In DFIs, the D is before the finance. So there's definitely a double bottom line, if not triple. And then with the pension plans and conventional private equity firms, there's a choice until regulation sort of kicks in. So it's this is one of the best things about this panel, is that it's not all one asset class or one type of investment firm. It's different levels. Gerhard, your reference to cake reminded me of something, not just that the cake here is very good. If you haven't tried it, the carrot cake was excellent, but it reminded me of this quote from this Wharton business school professor: ESG is like MSG. It tastes good, but you don't know if it's good for you. Surprisingly, we had this Slido up a few minutes ago to take questions from the audience, and one of the questions pertains to that. The question says, it's from Nowhere, there's a sentiment sometimes that ESG is simply a compliance aspect to access greater funding and adopt culture in the West. What do you think the future holds for these markets and the adoption of ESG? He did refer to emerging markets here, but I think it's a general question that could be applied anywhere. Any thoughts? That ESG is a compliance aspect to greater funding, meaning is there an actual business case for ESG that's emerging, or is this only to differentiate?
I'll be very short with one specific example I was thinking about here. Is the challenge with, put whatever name you want ESG sustainability is, most people actually don't understand how it is good for business. I think that's, honestly, in my experience, with all the different companies that we own, and to be fair, they are very compliant with things that we ask them to fill out, including data on ESG. But a really good example of this is that we have our portfolio companies all have some sort of an ESG policy. We're going into having them have a climate policy, et cetera. And we've got a business that sells into large financial institutions. And I'm not making this up. I think it was 2 or 3 weeks after we had them fill out their first ever ESG policy. They came back to me and said, hey, in one of the RFPs that we were doing, they asked about it. And where we typically think that it's not that important, and we would just say, no, we don't have one, we're going to make one, et cetera, they said that they had one. And again, it's a yes or no, it's not like a big thing. But then the customer actually called them and said that, oh, wow, you have a policy most people don't, that's a differentiator for you, and it moved them forward, right? So I think there's an element of a lack of knowledge of how these things can be helpful for businesses because, again, taking a macro view, most large multinational organizations are now under pressure for whether it's, Paris Accord in Europe or, just general good hygiene in the US or, North America. That's now starting to trickle down to people making vendor decisions based on these things. So I don't think, yes, I think, generally speaking, and I'll pick on the US because I have more experience on the US is very behind on understanding this, and we don't need to get into the politics of it all. But I have personally experienced, I just gave you one example, but many examples of how it has helped businesses get revenue because they had consciously made these types of decisions. So I think it is helping.
Mm-hmm. Great perspective, Hasan. Thank you. Any other thoughts on that?
I mean, I think, despite, I think, hiccups in the last few years, I think we're moving beyond just ESG as a check-the-box exercise. I mean, the regulations are there increasingly in certain markets because I think there's the recognition that there's a real risk of inaction of tackling issues around climate change, biodiversity loss, social inequalities. Like, they represent real risk to investors and society. And so I think that has created, I think, a velocity for the movement, and I think increasing harmonization of approaches, which is really important. I think the question about what does this mean then for the private sector companies or projects or people seeking funding and investments in emerging and developing economies, I do think that investors like us have a role to really enable companies to align and understand, where those gaps are, and provide the required assistance to bring them, towards meeting the high standards around ESG. And I think it links back, Hasan, to your point that these are like really critical to risk management, but also into positive. There's a positive opportunities that investors are seeking through integrating ESG and as a lens in their investment portfolio.
Wonderful. So we have about 20 minutes for this panel, and we thought we'd structure it with one juicy question. 10 minutes we can spend on that, which has lots of intersections. Actually, in fact, I don't know if Vivek is still here, but we were talking about this earlier when we met before his talk in the morning. We know, and sorry, just for the structure, we'll do 10 minutes of the last question, and then we'll do in-person questions. So we did one on Slido. The elephant in the room related to investment is the protests and encampments that are happening very close to home. Now, with respect to that, some of the things that are being asked about is things like transparency in investment portfolios, human rights integration, and so on. So, Brian, maybe I can start with you on transparency. Given the growing calls for transparency into investment portfolios, what are the key challenges financial institutions face in meeting these demands, and what are some of the considerations that go into UPP's reporting approach?
Okay, thanks. So interesting. So as I came in this morning, it was on the Current, I think, on the morning, and they talked to a professor at the at University of Ottawa. He basically asked the exact same question, and so this is his answer. Just kidding. I'm good. No, it's been on the Current a number of times, or Metro Morning, for the past few weeks. So definitely top of mind, something we're paying a lot of attention to. So reminder, UPP manages the pension assets of people, so staff and faculty at the universities. If I go back to our investment beliefs, all the way back there. So we're about 3 years old. One of the first things we did was come up with a set of investment beliefs. The final investment beliefs, one of the things it touches on is transparency. We're only going to be successful as investors if our members and other stakeholders kind of have a sense of what we're doing and why we're doing it. So we put that in there in our investment beliefs. But the challenge is, how do we provide that transparency? So we start with transparency around our policies and our strategies. So those are the key foundational documents that guide our approach to investing, not just what we call responsible investing, but investing writ large. So our statement of investment policies and procedures, our responsible investing policy, our proxy voting policy, our exclusion policy are all available on our website. So that's kind of the first port of call. The other piece around transparency that's kind of complicated for us is that as we're jointly sponsored, so we have employer sponsors, which have decision rights around the plan text itself, decision rights around other pieces of governance. They appoint a board of trustees, which has additional decision rights as well. And then it comes down to management. So there's lots of eyes and lots of people making different decisions about different bits and pieces of what we can make publicly available. But what we've tried to do over time is sort of build out different pieces of disclosure. So we've put some forward-looking pieces out. So we have a climate action plan. It talks about what we're doing from a climate perspective. We have a stewardship plan related to climate. We're going to have a social stewardship plan that we'll be publishing later this year. We have a climate investment framework which guides some of our forward-looking decisions around how we invest. And so those things are evolving. We disclose who our investment managers are. We disclose all of our investments above $5 million. Those are all on our website. We talk about our asset mix on our website. So we're 3 years old, and we're trying to get out there with as much information as possible, because we do see that it's important to our members and other stakeholders within the university community. So we're trying to move that forward.
Provides a great perspective, Brian. And Stéphanie, with that, Brian mentioned human rights policies. Is there something the conventional investment world can learn from development finance, seeing that when we're going into emerging markets and the global south, we have to be very sensitive of how we operate there through our investments and what we're supporting and what we're not, and what those companies are doing and how they treat their communities and stakeholders? Is there something we can learn from that, because within the pension place, within the private equity sector, that's what we're doing overseas?
I can't speak from necessarily the learning perspective, but I can speak to how what we've learned from our peers in order to integrate environmental and social risk screening, including human rights risk assessments in our portfolio. So we really looked at the International Finance Corporation's performance standards, and as that key benchmark, the principal benchmark that we look at for all of our investments, projects, financial institutions, and funds and corporates. And we also, look towards the UN guiding principles for business and human rights, and look to align with those key principles.
Wonderful. Gerhard, what about from an impact perspective and transparency, human rights issues related to portfolios?
Yeah, agree on transparency. We need to be transparent to our stakeholders, for sure, completely. We don't. Back in the day, there were the SRI mutual funds, social responsible investment mutual funds, and that was kind of a first step for many investors, which basically you cut out the bad stuff, you cut out the armaments, you cut out the tobacco, you cut out the whatever. It was a compliance approach, and then you kept wondering, like, should we cut this out? Should we cut that out? ESG started along similar lines. Many institutional investors who use ESG principles or strategies use it from a compliance-driven perspective. Or do we have enough E? Do we have enough S? Whatever. Impact investing was different. It came along to engage in positive change. So I don't care. Well, I was going to say I don't care about compliance. I do care about compliance, but that's not what. If we're just driven by compliance, we're driven by compliance. We're not going to make the positive changes in the world that we're trying to make. And so in private equity and private markets, private equity and venture capital, we choose the companies we invest in. We choose the companies we buy. And then we're engaged directly with companies like that. We work with local private equity managers in emerging markets and directly with companies where the leaders, the CEOs, the leaders, are interested in embracing these principles, of progressive management, sustainability, et cetera, et cetera. And so we generally don't find ourselves in challenging spots like divestment campaigns and boycotts and things like that, because we're at the other side of the spectrum. We're looking to build healthy new economies. Of course, there's going to be situations, nothing's black and white, and you run into problems, but our work then is to try to figure out what's a positive engagement, what's a positive response, how can we improve the world as opposed to trying to just stay away from the bad stuff. So, yeah.
Stephanie?
Just maybe on that, because so I agree that, you know, when you take that positive lens, you get really excited. But, you know, for us, and it's interesting, Majid and I collaborated on several projects over the years, but one of them is really, you know, looking for us, driving that positive impact. Well, the other side of that coin is the potential negative impact. And when you're working with a company and you're trying to get them to, you know, grow the percentage of women as part of their workplace, but if the workplace is not a safe environment for women, you're increasing that risk. So how, you know, for us, really understanding that that company that we're lending to or investing in, you know, do they have the right systems in place, you know, policy, right staff, procedures, et cetera, to effectively, you know, identify, prevent, and manage and mitigate the many environmental and social risks that are part of business operations. And sometimes that can be more acute in emerging and developing economies, you know, depending on the regulatory framework, for example. So, but it's, you know, as investors, you can't manage that risk directly. So it's really about understanding your clients or your investees' intent, like awareness level and intention about driving positive impact or managing effectively risk, and their capacity. Do they have the right systems and people in place?
And that just there's additional challenges, which, for example, if we were working in emerging markets, we run successful companies that had 5,000 employees, now they have 50,000 employees, and okay, 50,000 employees now have gainful employment, families put food on the table, they used to walk to work, now they're riding bicycles, they're riding motorcycles, riding cars. That's bad for the environment, they're consuming more resources, and so all this great stuff we're doing, but how do you count the unintended consequences? How do you measure the downsides and the negatives, which are kind of beyond our ability to measure, but we got to be conscious of that because it's, well, we can report all sorts of golden statistics. There's other stuff on the side that we don't tell you. Well, actually, we can't really measure, but we need to be aware and transparent about all of that.
Definitely, and it reminds me of the systems approach that Helen Kerr was talking about earlier in the morning, is being able to monitor all the different systems that are intersectional and being impacted. This was an amazing discussion. I have lots more questions here in case, you know, the audience doesn't, but I'm sure they will. We wanted to give you guys a chance to ask your questions to the speakers, and I hope the mics are somewhere around. There's a question in the front.
Good afternoon. Thank you for all of your insights today. I had a question related to emerging markets. And the question is specifically targeted at this tension that lies in the ESG enterprise globally. And this fact is that, you know, the developed world has had the opportunity to pursue immense, profit, immense amounts of, development at the expense of the environment, at the expense of things that are very pertinent to us now. So how do we, in the developed world, how are we communicating, how are we conversing, how are we dialoguing with these emerging markets and convincing them? How is that process unfolding? In terms of pursuing ESG, because of those disparities, historical and contemporary?
Gerhard, did you want to start? And maybe Stephanie?
Sure. I have been asked by people, you screwed up the environment and now you want us to care for the environment after you've become rich. I have heard that argument. And it's valid. So I'm not proud. But we do, when we, I think I mentioned earlier, when we invest in companies, we look for leaders that are eager to embrace a healthy new economy within their company, within their community. And so there's that. One other thing I should say is that emerging markets, the private equity sector in emerging markets is far more conversant about ESG and certainly environmental and social strategies than is the private equity sector in North America and Europe. And that's largely because the Stephanies of the world have came in and opened up, created the private markets in the private equity and venture capital markets in Latin America, Africa, Asia, and required certain understandings about social issues, environmental issues, and the like, which the private equity sector never had to go through here in Europe and North America. Good point. I don't have a full answer for that. It's a reality that the world is grappling with, clearly. There's no clear way out of that one.
Stephanie?
Unless you have all the answers.
No, I do think that, though, and just this, FinDev Canada is relatively young, but I do think that our peer institutions, I agree with you, that, have built a lot of capacity in the development finance space in emerging economies that set them up to deal with, investors who are increasingly interested in ESG matters. Maybe I think besides ESG, I think that discussion about, I think that the just transition conversations and, countries that are moving to develop just transition energy plans where they're engaging with governments, with donors, and the private sector to really carefully think about the reality that we do need to transition our energy models, but do it in a way that can contribute to economic development where, communities are able to benefit from, green jobs, for example. So I do think that conversation in emerging market and developing economies in our ecosystem is important and there.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Stephanie. Do we have a next question? Is the mic with someone?
Yep.
Oh, Amit, sorry.
Hi, I'm Amit. I'm a PhD student in sustainability management here. Really enjoying this conversation. My question is primarily to Gerhard and Stéphanie. So from the perspective of investing in emerging markets, how seriously do you gauge the due diligence of environmental assessment reports, which the companies are obligated to use in order to mitigate their business operations and risks? So often, in both emerging and also in developed markets, environmental assessment itself and who does it, how it's done, the due diligence itself, sometimes is at conflict of interest, right? So, as an investor, do you look into these reports that the companies that you're investing in have used in order to basically mitigate the risks? Thank you.
I can start. Yeah, so as an investor or financier, so we do our own due diligence. So on the financial side, impact side, governance side, business integrity, as well as environmental and social. So we do our own environmental and social risk due diligence. And depending on, whether we lend to a financial cooperative or a commercial bank, or we are looking at a renewable energy private equity fund or a renewable, a sustainable infrastructure project, that due diligence plan will be different because there's different risks that are triggered. But so sometimes we will also rely on or engage, a third-party assessment of those risks. So we don't rely on a company sharing their own, their own information. We do our own due diligence process, which in many cases requires some in-person visits. In terms of, what is the core is that for, aligned with the IFC performance standard, we will require our clients to have effective systems to assess, identify, manage environmental and social risks, depending on their context. That, as I said, will depend on the type of investee or client that we invest in. Mm-hmm. So if it's a financial cooperative, we'll look at human resources, policies. Do they have effective grievance mechanism? Do they have responsible lending practices? If it's an infrastructure project, we'll look at, stakeholder community engagement, health and safety at the construction phase, but we do our own environmental and social due diligence.
We just had time for one last question. Gerhard, did you want to give a quick response to that, or should we do that?
Just that we have deliberately stayed away from resource extractive sectors. We invest growth equity into operating companies, and we look for leaders that embrace positive strategies, positive worldview. So we're not, environmental assessments is important. But we're less exposed to that risk than at those mid-market growth stage level. Yeah.
Perfect. And so sorry to the audience members that we're going to take one last question from Slido. In case you had something, you can always catch the speakers after the panel. Maybe a minute each, Hasan and Brian. The question is, does short-term versus long-term planning make a difference when it comes to this question of fiduciary duty, managing fiduciary duty with ESG impact and responsible impact? Is it a time-related thing, or is it the same whether you're doing short-term planning or long-term planning? Hasan, did you want to start? And then Brian can, maybe a minute each.
Yeah, I think, look, with any operational initiative in the businesses that we buy, they're relatively time-bound, 3 to 5 years, roughly speaking. Any improvements that we're looking to make in our businesses from a sustainability standpoint will have a similar timeline to any of the operational improvements that we're looking to make. We do try and very early, the more data that we can get early in the investment. So it's one of the first things that we try to do is, hey, here's a platform, please start putting in, because that will then help us identify the deficiencies and areas that we want to improve. So I would say data gathering and planning for policies would be earliest, assuming they have nothing. But then improvements are, again, the same way that we're trying to improve anything in a business. That's going to be a longer term, some of those things you can't do overnight. And then we look to kind of review it, generally speaking, every quarter at a board meeting.
Perfect. Brian?
I don't know how to answer. So how about intergenerational equity is a really tough thing for just people and humans to deal with. And then if you think about it in the pension fund context, it's like a microcosm of that. So we have to invest for the long term. So someone who's coming to work at a university for the first time today, we're going to take in all their contributions over their working lifetime if they stay working, and then we're going to pay out their pension until they, pass away. So that's that person. We have to have intergenerational equity between that person as well as the person who's only going to be retired for one more year. So those decisions, that has to factor into decisions that we make. So definitely some of it's very long-term in nature, but there's also the real, short term of we have to continue to pay pensions that are due next month.
Very interesting. That brings us to the end of our panel. Thank you so much to the panelists and to the audience for the great questions. Thank you so much. Thank you. Hand it back to Leah here.
And a big thank you to our moderator, Majid, for shedding some light on balancing fiduciary duty with environmental and social impact. Before we take another short break, we wanted to share a few details and reminders. For our in-person audience, There will be 2 breakout sessions following our 15-minute break at 2:45 p.m. The Future Cities breakout workshop will be happening in breakout room A across the courtyard. There are signs around. And the Sustainable Finance with Fireside Chat and a case study conversation will start here in the auditorium, and then it will move to the breakout room B. Both breakout rooms are adjacent to each other, and there are signs around the venue to direct you to the breakout rooms. If you are not sure where to go, please see one of our volunteers or conference staff wearing a lanyard to help you.
So this will be our last time on stage today. Putri and I would like to thank you for your participation in day 1 of Together Ensemble. A friendly reminder that we have a networking event and refreshments available at the Delta Hotel following the breakout session. So that will be between 4 and 6 p.m. Our volunteers will be at the main door to help with wayfinding to the Delta Hotel, which is just adjacent across the street. And volunteers will be walking groups over at 4:05 p.m. and then again at 4:15 p.m.
Leanne, I had so much fun learning today. We had a great lineup for tomorrow with sessions in ESG, AI, and emerging tech. We are also very excited for our 2 panels, keynote, and a fireside chat tomorrow for our day 2 agenda. And a very special thank you to ESG Tree for making an impactful contribution to the conference as our organizing partner.
So the refreshments are available outside of the auditorium for our in-person audience, and we'll say goodbye to our online audience for today and see you back tomorrow morning. And just a reminder, of course, the volunteers will help you navigate, and the breakout sessions start at 2:45, and we hope to see you at our networking event at 4 p.m. today across the street.
Thank you.